The podcast you're about to hear includes the story of a Katzie man named Slumuk. Members of the Katzie First Nation have been instrumental in us telling the story properly. We acknowledge that the story of Slumuk originates from the ancestral lands of the Katzie people. What you're about to hear you may find graphic and violent in nature. Listener discretion is advised. As the Cold War raged on, Alfred Hitchcock's Dial M for Murder hit number one at the box office in June 1954. At the same time in British Columbia, 18-year-old Jack Mould set out on a cool early dawn with his father, Charlie Mould, in search of Slumuk's lost gold. The Moulds left from the dock near their home in Campbell River, a logging town on the eastern shore of Vancouver Island. They sailed in their fishing boat across the chilly waters of the Georgia Strait and up into the deep and imposing valley of Bute Inlet. By the time they anchored in the marshes near the Homolka River, about 80 kilometers from the entrance to the inlet, it was nighttime. Jack caught a salmon and Charlie cooked it over a campfire on the shore. They slept in the boat that night. The next morning, Charlie left Jack to guard the boat as he hiked into the mountains. Jack ambled up and down the shoreline and scanned the horizon where the land and water meet. By afternoon, he was whacking through the thick underbrush several feet away from the water when he saw them. A tree with strange markings, the likes of which he'd never seen before, along with some very old, rusty cable wire. When Charlie returned, in good spirits, exhausted and without gold, Jack showed his dad what he had discovered. Charlie surveyed the tree and wire silently for a few minutes before he finally spoke. "Well, Jack," Charlie said, "you found where they probably loaded the gold." Jack responded confused. "Who loaded the gold?" "The Spaniards, son. I found where they mined it." I'm Kru Williams, and this is Dead Man's Curse, Volcanic Gold. Episode 10, Charlie Mould and Spanish Gold. As we mentioned in the previous episode, before he vanished, Jack Mould's obsessions were first stoked by his father, Charlie. Charlie believed the Spanish explorers began mining and processing gold in the years before the British officially claimed what became British Columbia. This gold is what Charlie believed had gotten Slumuk in trouble, and the Moulds believed the gold was still out there waiting to be found. They would spend their lives searching for it. As we mentioned last time, we know Spain laid claim to the entire Pacific Ocean and all the surrounding lands for over 400 years. Explorers had been sailing the coast off the Pacific Northwest of North America towards the end of the 1700s, until the British swooped in and blocked them. Those events are on the record, but the records we've seen don't mention much gold at all. And if you've been with us since season 1, you know that the official records don't always tell the whole story. Would the Spanish have been up to something they didn't want anyone else to know about? And what clues might they have left behind?
So the Spanish kingdom, it's a large empire. It's very bureaucratic. Typically, Spanish nobles needed either funding or permission to go exploring. So a lot of the records we have are of these expeditions where, the governor of Mexico through the king of Spain would outfit ships and say, sail north and establish outposts. But it's also possible that there were maybe merchants who were either wealthy enough or maybe adventurous enough to fund small single ship explorations.
Scott Williams is author and executive director of the Maritime Archaeological Association in Astoria, Oregon. He says when looking at history, you can't just rely on official records.
Spanish exploring, not all of which were recorded, but there's good evidence there were more Spanish ships up here, possibly other European ships, than we have written records of. And we know that from the Native American oral histories. So I've been told by a good friend of mine in one of the Northwest Washington coast tribes that they have oral histories of Spanish slavers coming up in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Now, at that point, there shouldn't have been any, there are no records of Spanish slavers that are written down. But if you were a slaver, you might not necessarily want those records written down. And so, that's one possibility. Either folks seeking slaves, folks seeking some kind of fortune they thought might be up here. That could be the explanation. And it's also possible, some of these smaller expeditions, the Spanish have so many records. They have, I think it's millions of pages of handwritten records from their 500 years of empire. People are still going through those. So maybe the information is there. It just hasn't been found yet.
One thing that has been found, a shipwreck of a Spanish galleon off the Oregon coast. If this sounds familiar, it's because a ship was found on the same location where the 1980s adventure movie The Goonies was set. Remember the pirate ship? The gold and jewels worth billions? The skeletons? Most enduring legends all have some element of truth. Scott's colleagues at the Maritime Archaeological Association have been investigating the shipwreck for years. And according to him, the bonanza treasure seekers are hunting might just be the tip of the iceberg.
So when we started researching the wreck of a Spanish galleon that we're pretty certain wrecked in 1693, trying to sort through the oral histories and those early settlers' written accounts of what the Native American people had told them, it's very clear there were other European shipwrecks, especially on the North Oregon coast.
The first shipwreck Scott referred to is most likely the Santo Cristo de Burgos, a galleon that left the Philippines in the summer of 1693, carrying goods to trade. It was headed for Acapulco, but was never seen again. And people are still looking for surviving riches to this day. The ship was a Manila galleon, which can also refer to the circular trade route itself between the colonial ports of Acapulco and Manila, that was operational for 250 years, from 1565 to 1815. And the whole purpose of that trade, at least on paper, was to deliver luxury goods from all over Asia: silk, spices, porcelain, rugs, art, and carved ivory, to sell in New Spain, as the Spanish colonies in the Americas were called in Europe. There were also enslaved people from the Philippines, Indonesia, even as far away as India and East Africa, who were transported and sold. Who knows what contraband was omitted or underreported on the ship's manifest? Typically, once a year, sometimes twice, a ship would make the trip by sailing north from Manila to catch the westerly trade winds of the Kuroshio Current off the coast of Japan. These would propel ships east across the North Pacific towards California, where they would then sail down the coast to Mexico. The journey would take at least 4 months, and the best time to sail was in the summer. A ship would leave the Philippines in June or July, get to Mexico in the fall to sell Asian luxury goods for silver. China was the main supplier, and the only commodity the Spanish had that the Chinese really wanted was silver. And Spain was sitting on the richest silver mines on Earth in colonial Mexico and Latin America. Ships would return filled with silver to the Philippines, buy Chinese goods, and continue that cycle for 250 years. The Santo Cristo de Burgos was one of those galleons. Manila galleons were built in Manila and were the largest ships of their time. Think of today's massive container ships, but made of ornate carved wood with huge white sails and masts like flagpoles. The Santo Cristo de Burgos probably carried 1,600 tons of cargo. By comparison, the Mayflower held 180 tons. Built in 1689, the Santo Cristo de Burgos first sailed the following year. At the helm was a Basque nobleman named Don Bernardo Iñiguez del Valle, which surprised many as he was the former mayor of the landlocked Mexican town in San Luis Potosi, and may have gotten the position by way of a little political patronage. Del Valle, while well-respected, had been the official head of the mounted cavalry, and although he was not a sailor, he successfully sailed the fully loaded ship on its maiden voyage to the Philippines. On the next trip, however, the ship hit a bad storm shortly after departure. It lost all 3 of its masts and limped back to port in Manila. This was devastating for the economy of Manila and the Philippines, which depended on the yearly cargo. So, if you screw that up, you were screwed, and Del Valle and his officers were all arrested for not completing the voyage. We have almost 1,000 pages of court documents from the dramatic trial that followed Del Valle, the crew, the cargo, how the ship was built, the repairs it needed, everything. In the end, Del Valle was cleared of all charges, but his officers were all removed from their post, and he was asked to pay a bond to ensure he would complete the next voyage. On July 31st, 1693, Del Valle snuck out of the port of Manila in the early morning hours to avoid payment, but left 10% of his crew behind. This meant he had only inexperienced officers for the journey to Mexico. Del Valle knew that he couldn't return to the Philippines if anything bad happened, so the captain and crew of the Santo Cristo de Burgos pushed onward no matter what. And then they were never heard from again.
Something caused them to wreck on the North Oregon coast, about 300 miles north of where they should be. So now what we don't know is, were they so far off course because a storm pushed them up there? Were they trying to sail further north to make up time? Were they just totally lost? I don't think that's the real answer, but for whatever reason, they wind up near the Nehalem River on the North Oregon coast.
Scott Williams is the executive director of the Maritime Archaeological Association, and he's played a major role in researching, cataloging, and preserving as much of the remnants of the ship as possible. He says the wreck of the Santo Cristo de Burgos was first identified when Beeswax arrived in Fort Astoria, Oregon.
When the fur traders set up Astoria as a fur trading settlement, the Clatsop and Nehalem Indians start bringing them large blocks of beeswax to trade along with the furs. And these are formed, molded blocks. They're candles. The blocks have symbols carved into them. They have numbers. There are no native honeybees in Oregon. So those fur traders ask the Clatsop and Nehalem Indians, where are you getting this beeswax? And they tell them, a big ship wrecked many years ago down by the Nehalem River. You want to go see? And you could still see the wreckage of the ship on the Nehalem Spit and at the mouth of the Nehalem River. So that starts in 1813 is our earliest written reference. And then throughout the 19th century, every European ship captain who comes into the Columbia River, every early European settler, every tourist who comes to the Pacific Northwest talks about the beeswax wreck and the mystery of what kind of ship could possibly be carrying so much beeswax. It was ancient by the late 19th century.
Beeswax, porcelain fragments, planks, and other wooden pieces of the ship have washed up along the beaches through the years, and items have either been housed in museums or kept as mementos by lucky beachcombers. But no precious metals and no gold have been found. Nothing's been reported, that is. Scott says there's another shipwreck off the Oregon coast that's a bit more in line with the legends of pirates plundering ships and hoarding treasures like One-Eyed Willie in the Goonies.
About 100 years after the Santo Cristo de Burgos wrecked, another ship, and again, this is one of those unrecorded European ships, but another ship sailed off the Nehalem Spit, anchored. The crew rowed ashore. They carried something up onto Neocani Mountain. They buried it. They rowed back out to their ship and they sailed away. So now when the Nehalem Indians told the first American settlers that, hey, after the Beeswax wreck, another ship came, rowed ashore, buried something, and sailed away, what do you think was the first thing the American settlers thought about? Pirates. Because obviously the only people who bury things on land are pirates. That started the legend or the story of what's called the Neocani treasure. So the whole Goonies, One-Eyed Willie ties really into this Neocani treasure story more so than the Spanish Galleon. But over the years, the two stories have become intertwined. So, it turns from the Santo Cristo de Burgos wrecks, and then 100 years later, a ship sails in and sails away, to 3 ships were involved in a cannon fight. One of them sank, the other limped away, the third one anchored, buried a giant chest with an 8-foot tall African slave with crossed swords on his chest to protect the chest. So there's at least 2 other ships that wrecked prior to, call it, 1790. And those 2 ships were probably Spanish, given the oral history accounts of the survivors and, how they acted, what they were named, that kind of thing. But what makes those accounts interesting to me, there shouldn't have been any Spanish ships in the Pacific Northwest in, say, 1725 or 1730. And yet there's very clear evidence that a ship out of Mexico wrecked near the mouth of the Columbia River sometime in that period. So who were those guys? What ship was it? No clue yet.
Now, granted, the Oregon coast is quite far away from Bute Inlet, British Columbia, but the Pacific Northwest is even farther away from Mexico, the Philippines, and Spain. Treasures travel, and legends travel even farther. The legend of Spanish gold, the legend of Slumox gold, and the legend of Charlie Mould all seem to converge in Jack Mould. He often told stories of his swashbuckling father, who taught him how to fish, how to hunt, and how to prospect for gold. Like most sons naturally want to do, Jack looked up to his father, Charlie. Born in England, Charlie Mould immigrated to Canada after World War I, hoping to prosper and thrive in the promised land of the West. He was a fur trapper, logger, and prospector known in the community for being industrious. And he did well during the 1920s when the demand for furs kept prices high. But then came the Great Depression, and along with it came great desperation and a need to diversify income streams. Judith Williams, author, visual artist, and professor emeritus at University of British Columbia, has written about the Moulds.
So Charlie Mould, like a lot of people, went to a trap to log, and like a lot of people, he surveyed. And many of the old-timers who went in homestead, they also surveyed for minerals and various things, gold being the top commodity. But and there is gold. It's not that there aren't these resources there. It's not very economic to get at some of them. And people get gold fever.
Charlie Mould saw a big opportunity just under the surface of the land and water, whether riches actually existed or not. And in the grand tradition of folks infected with gold fever, he instilled that belief into his sons, planting a seed that would grow into a lifelong obsession for one of them. Judith Williams wrote that Charlie Mould, quote, repeatedly told tales of how a native man had tracked him for his large gold nugget, or Charlie tracked the native man for his nugget, end quote.
Charlie, firmly believing his own stories about seeing a huge nugget of gold, connected with a First Nations man, which he, in his telling, he may have killed. It's not sure. And so when he had two sons, and when they were in their teens, he took them up to Bute, and he told them the stories that he had about the Spanish mining for gold in there.
We know the timelines of Charlie Mould and Slumac barely intersected, if at all. Slumac was executed for murder in 1891. Charlie Mould may have been born a few years later, but we don't have his exact birth date. The story of Charlie being tracked by an indigenous man for his gold nugget could very well be his way of connecting with the legend of Slumac that would have been circulating as his sons were growing up. It could be his way of connecting with his sons. Regardless, it was the seed that sprouted into a lifelong obsession with Slumac's lost gold mine for Jack Mould. In the 1993 quasi-memoir, Jack Mould and the Curse of Gold, written by Elizabeth Hawkins, as told to her by Jack himself, we get the story of Charlie taking teenage Jack into the mountainous wilderness at the head of Bute Inlet, which you heard about at the beginning of this episode. In that story, father and son take their fishing boat deep into the foreboding interior, 80 kilometers from the mouth of the inlet. Charlie finds something interesting he wanted to show Jack. For almost 2 decades, Charlie's burning desire to find Slumac's treasure kept him going into the mountains around Bute Inlet, but many decades of failure led him to almost giving up. His son, Jack, would be his best hope for continuing the legacy. Charlie and Jack trekked into the wilderness for 4 hours, stopping only once for a 10-minute break. Eventually, they stopped on the grassy bank of an ice-cold creek for lunch. When he finished eating, Charlie took a gold pan and dipped it into the swiftly running creek. He showed Jack the tiny sparkly bits of gold shining in the sun. Charlie told Jack to follow him into the forest. He hopped onto a stone mid-creek, then hopped again to the other side and disappeared into the bush. Jack followed, and after a few minutes, they both found themselves in a clearing, staring into the mouth of a huge cave in the sheer rock face that loomed ahead. Charlie pulled out his flashlight, and he and Jack entered the cave, whose mouth was tall enough for father and son to stand erect. They walked for what seemed like several minutes. Charlie beamed the flashlight over the walls and told Jack that these were not the formation of naturally occurring caves. The original cave may have been natural, he told Jack, but had been enlarged by human ingenuity. Charlie was sure someone had been digging for gold, and he'd hoped they didn't find it, or all of it anyway. Father and son turned around, and when they reemerged into the forest clearing, they walked along the face of the giant cliff that loomed over them. Soon, Charlie stopped and pointed into a pile of what looked like charred and fossilized wood. He told Jack that in the old days, it wasn't easy to dig into solid rock, but miners improvised by building a scaffold of timbers along the rock face and setting the wood on fire. Then, once the rock had absorbed as much heat as possible, they could throw cold water on the rock and strike it at the same time with hammers and picks. The rock would fall away, and the miners would tunnel deeper and deeper into the mountain. Charlie reckoned that the charred timbers he was pointing out to Jack were remnants of burned wood used by miners to help them chisel out the cave. Impressed, Jack asked his father if it was the Indians, as he called them. Charlie replied that he was pretty sure it was Spaniards. Jack couldn't believe it. Spaniards? This deep in Bute Inlet? Charlie had more to show him, and he led his son to a patch of thick brush. Underneath was a rotting piece of wood covered in moss. Jack saw it and told Charlie it looked like an old carved door, which Charlie said it was. Charlie scraped some of the moss and explained to his son that the figure showed the kinds of armor and helmets worn by Spanish soldiers. Jack looked at the door, weathered from age, and admitted to himself that they did look like soldiers, especially now that his father had pointed it out. Charlie conceded that it could have been the work of an indigenous craftsman, but the images were of Spanish soldiers who may have been right there where they stood, in the wilderness above Bute Inlet. Or near there at least. But there was more. Charlie took his son Jack to a remote location to show him evidence of what he believed was Spanish presence in Bute Inlet. After showing Jack what appeared to be a carved door, Charlie went into the nearby brush and pulled out a large iron bucket lined with a few bits of leather that hadn't rotted away yet. Inside were 2 grooved metal wheels that looked like they were parts of a pulley block and tackle rig. Charlie was sure this was not an indigenous innovation. He was sure the Spanish had been right here, and he was sure they had dug the cave mining for gold and used the bucket and pulley to transport supplies in and out. But he wasn't sure if they had actually found anything. He was only sure if they had gone through the trouble of chiseling out a cave on the side of a cliff face. They must have had a hunch that a bonanza was close. Charlie told Jack that the Spanish would never have left it if they found the motherlode he was searching for. But we know the Spanish did leave. The Third Nootka Convention in 1794 pretty much spelled the end of their permanent presence in the Pacific Northwest, and was the first domino to fall in the gradual breakup of the 400-year-old Spanish Empire only a few decades later. In 1819, as the empire fell apart and Spain fought several wars, it seceded all of Florida, most of its claims to the massive Louisiana territory, and all of its claims to the Pacific Northwest to the United States. Officially, the Spanish were gone. But Charlie Mould had a hunch. Based on bits and pieces of artifacts he claimed to be Spanish, that they had been mining and processing gold in the vicinity of Bute Inlet. Author Judith Williams says it was enough evidence for Charlie to get his sons involved, and for Jack, it became a lifelong obsession.
He said, all my life I wanted to find the gold. He said, I want the gold, and I want the glory of finding the gold. So this is how he taught.
Did his single-minded focus on gold and his disrespect of the land and the people make Jack a victim of the curse?
He didn't care about anything other than the gold, and that probably just led him to his demise.
That's next time on Dead Man's Curse, Volcanic Gold. Thank you for joining me, and special thanks to Scott Williams and Judith Williams for their work in this episode. Dead Man's Curse is hosted by myself, Kru Williams, and written by Ernest White II and Dila Velasquez. Our producers are Dila Velasquez and Jessica Young. Audio producers are Rosalind Kufor and Rob Johnston. Sound design by Rob Johnston. Our associate producer and Indigenous cultural and heritage consultant is Gail Starr. Our executive producers are Chris Duncombe, Ernest White II, Michael Francis, Kru Williams, Tim Hardy, and David Way. Dead Man's Curse is a production of Curious Cast, podcast for curious minds, and Great Pacific Media. For more information on this episode, follow us on social media, check out our website, and check out our show notes for additional information. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time on Dead Man's Curse, Volcanic Gold.